You know what's worse than facing the London system? Playing against someone who actually knows the Semi-Slav defense. It's solid and flexible, and it's been trusted by world champions for decades. But here's the best part. You don't need to memorize 10 hours of theory to make it work. This is the Semi-Slav Defense, and if you're looking for a real weapon against one of White's most popular openings, this might just be your new favorite. So what exactly is the Semi-Slav? It starts when White plays pawn to d4, and you respond with pawn to d5. White plays pawn to c4, trying to take control of the center. You reply with pawn to c6, setting up a rock-solid foundation. Next, White develops the knight to f3, and you develop your knight to f6. Then White brings out the other knight to c3, and you play pawn to e6. And just like that, you're in the Semi-Slav defense. That small pawn move to e6 changes everything. It supports the center. It opens the door for your dark-squared bishop. And most importantly, it creates a structure that's incredibly hard to break. So why is the Semi-Slav so good? First, it's extremely solid. You're not taking wild risks or weakening your position early. Second, it's flexible. Depending on how White plays, you can go for slow, positional setups or explosive counterattacks. Third, it's been used at the highest levels of chess. Magnus Carlsen, Vladimir Kramnik, Anand, all of them have played the Semi-Slav. Fourth, it works against players who don't study theory. A lot of beginners and even intermediate players have no idea how to break it. And finally, it grows with your rating. The same setup you use as a beginner is still relevant at advanced levels. And here's the kicker. While your opponent needs to know a ton of different variations to challenge you, you only need to understand a few core ideas to play it well. Let's take a look at one of the most classical and instructive variations in the Semi-Slav defense, a line that balances patience, structure, and long-term plans. The game starts with White pushing the pawn to d4, and Black responding with pawn to d5. White goes for pawn to c4, aiming to control the center. Black plays pawn to e6. White develops the knight to c3, and now Black plays pawn to c6. This is the Semi-Slav setup, a rock-solid triangle that defends the center and prepares for flexible development. White brings out the other knight to f3, and Black mirrors with knight to f6. Then White plays bishop to g5, pinning the knight. Black immediately challenges it with pawn to h6. White decides to trade on f6, giving up the bishop for the knight. Black recaptures with the queen. Now Black has the bishop pair and slightly more central control. White follows up with pawn to e3, reinforcing the center and opening the light-squared bishop. Black develops the knight to d7, preparing to support the c5 or e5 push later. White plays bishop to d3, a natural developing move. Now Black captures in the center with pawn takes pawn on c4. White recaptures with the bishop, keeping activity and pressure. Black plays pawn to g6, preparing to fianchetto the light-squared bishop and control the long diagonal. White castles kingside, and Black develops bishop to g7. Now both players are fully committed to their setups. White brings the rook to c1, putting pressure on the semi-open c-file. Black quietly tucks the queen away to e7, preparing to castle. White plays pawn to e4, a strong central move, taking space and threatening an e5 push. Black responds by castling kingside, keeping the king safe. Then rook to e1 by White, supporting the center and preparing to break through. Black brings the rook to d8, adding tension to the center and possibly targeting the queen pawn in the future. Now comes pawn to e5, an aggressive space-gaining move from White, trying to restrict Black's knight and open the position. Black calmly plays pawn to b5, looking for queenside expansion and a bit of counterplay. White's bishop steps back to d3, keeping control over key dark squares. And finally, Black develops the bishop to b7, completing development and eyeing that long diagonal. This is where the position starts to heat up. Both sides have fully developed their armies, the center is about to open, and the game is ready to explode with tactics and long-term strategies. Black has a solid pawn chain, active bishops, and queenside counterplay, while White controls space and is aiming to break through in the center. This is a textbook Semi-Slav middle game, balanced, dynamic, and rich with ideas. Now let's take a look at another powerful variation in the Semi-Slav, one that shows how Black can build tension and strike at just the right moment. This time White plays pawn to e3, locking in the structure and preparing to bring out the light-squared bishop. Black now plays knight to d7, reinforcing the center and preparing a flexible plan. White develops the bishop to d3, and Black plays pawn takes pawn on c4. White recaptures with the bishop, keeping control and staying active. Now black pushes pawn to b5, expanding on the queenside and challenging the bishop. White calmly retreats the bishop to d3, and black develops bishop to b7, adding pressure to the long diagonal. White castles kingside and black plays pawn to a6, preparing to push even further with b4 and gain space. Then white strikes in the center with pawn to e4. This is a very thematic move in the Semi-Slav. White is trying to open the center before black gets too much queenside space. Now black plays pawn to c5, and this is a critical moment in the position. When black plays pawn to c5, the board shifts into a new phase of the game. White now has 3 logical moves to choose from, and in this video, we're going to take a look at all of them. The first option is if white captures the pawn. So let's break that down. White plays pawn takes on c5, and black recaptures with the bishop to c5. The center opens up, and suddenly both bishops are very active. White continues with queen to e2, preparing to put more pressure on the center. Black quietly develops the queen to b8, keeping an eye on the long diagonal and getting ready to shift pieces to the queenside if needed. White plays bishop to g5, pinning the knight and threatening to increase pressure. And black castles kingside, getting the king safe and finishing development. This line leads to a very open and tactical position. Both sides have active bishops, and the center is no longer blocked, which means any small mistake can quickly turn into a big problem. In this variation, white gets fast development, but black gains dynamic piece activity and control over key diagonals. It's balanced but sharp, and definitely not a position where you can afford to play passively. Next, we'll look at the second response white can choose after black plays pawn to c5. Now let's take a look at the second option white has after black plays pawn to c5. Instead of capturing the pawn, white pushes forward with pawn to e5, gaining space, attacking the knight, and trying to take control of the center by force. Black responds with pawn takes pawn on d4, opening up the center right away. White recaptures with the knight, jumping into the center. Then black takes pawn on e5 with knight, and white plays bishop to e3, keeping pressure on the center files. Black develops the bishop to c5, putting immediate pressure on the center and the dark squares. White now plays bishop to e2, opening lines for the queen. Black quietly plays queen to b6, lining up with the bishop and preparing for an attack. White brings the knight to c2, a maneuver to defend b4 and maybe reroute it later to e3 or d4. Black brings the rook to d8, placing it directly opposite white's queen, subtle but powerful. White plays queen to c1, stepping out of the rook's way and indirectly pressuring c5. Now black plays knight to g4, jumping in and eyeing f2 and e3. White decides to capture on c5 with the bishop, and black plays the unexpected queen to c7, threatening a mate in 1. Then white plays pawn to g3, preventing mate. Black plays queen to c6, threatening mate again. White follows up with pawn to f3, trying to kick the knight and keep control. But black is ready and goes queen takes bishop on c5 with check. White brings the king to g2, getting off the back rank and hiding from tactics. Now black pushes pawn to b4, beginning a queenside assault. This variation is sharp, full of ideas, and both sides must be very precise. White grabs space in the center with e5 and tries to dominate early, but black hits back immediately with tactical counterplay and piece activity. It's a battle of speed versus structure, and it shows just how rich the Semi-Slav can be. Now before we look at the third main option, there's one sharp sideline we absolutely have to cover. After black pushes the pawn to c5 and white replies with pawn to e5. Black plays pawn takes pawn in the center, and instead of recapturing with the knight, white plays pawn takes knight on f6. This is an aggressive idea. White is giving up the center for immediate pressure and opening lines toward the king. Black takes the knight on c3 with pawn. Now white continues with pawn takes on g7. Black recaptures with bishop. This bishop is now incredibly active, slicing through the board and putting real pressure on white's queenside. White takes our pawn on c3 and we recapture with the bishop. White responds with rook to b1, moving out of the bishop's way and lining up pressure on the b-file. But black calmly plays knight to c5, reinforcing the bishop, locking down the center, and preparing a deadly coordination of pieces. At this point, white has the bishop pair and open lines, but black has a rock-solid center and more active pieces. This line is double-edged. If white plays precisely, they can keep up the pressure and possibly aim for an attack on the king side. But one wrong step, and black's bishop pair and central control can take over the game. Now that we've covered that sharp pawn capture idea, let's look at the final major option white has after black plays pawn to c5. Now let's look at the third option white can play after black pushes the pawn to c5. This time white doesn't capture and doesn't push e5. Instead, white pushes the d-pawn to d5, immediately gaining space and challenging black's structure. Black doesn't waste time and plays queen to c7, putting pressure on the c-file and preparing to support the center. White keeps pushing with pawn takes e6, and black recaptures with the f-pawn, opening the f-file for future counterplay. Then white brings out the light-squared bishop to c2, keeping it safe and lining it up for kingside ideas. Black develops the dark-squared bishop to d6, eyeing that dangerous long diagonal toward white's king. Now white plays knight to g5, jumping forward and hinting at an attack. Black answers with knight to f8, defending and preparing to reroute the knight if needed. White builds up pressure with pawn to f4, getting ready for a kingside assault. Black castles queenside, showing that this game is going to turn into a race on opposite wings. White places the queen on e2, lining it up behind the pawn wall. Black plays pawn to h6, asking the knight a question. White jumps the knight back to f3, keeping it active and flexible. Black now takes on f4 with bishop. White responds with pawn to e5, hitting the knight and pushing the initiative. Black captures the bishop on c1, and white recaptures with the rook. Then black places the knight on d5, centralizing and controlling both wings. This line is more positional but still sharp. White tries to crash through the kingside, while black holds the center and fights back with piece activity and open lines. It's the kind of position where one tempo can decide the game, and both players need to know their ideas. So that wraps up all three major paths white can take after you play pawn to c5 in the Semi-Slav defense. Whether they capture, push e5, or try to steamroll with d5, now you're ready to meet them with confidence. If you want to go deeper and build a complete opening repertoire step by step, check out the Chess Opening Guides playlist on this channel. It's packed with practical lines, simple plans, and powerful traps you can start using today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.